Welcome to the video lecture on Chapter 5, Cultural and Linguistic Diversity. Students with disabilities and students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds have several characteristics. These are individuals whose culture and their language is different from the majority of the population. Examples of these type of students would be students whose first language is not English, but these are students living in the United States. This could also be an example of students who are from a different culture, such as the Navajo Indians, and they are living in the United States, but they are continuing to live according to the culture of their forefathers. The emergent bilingual learners are persons who are in the process of becoming a fluent speaker of two or more languages. This is including the academic language of the languages spoken. For example, it could be their heritage language or the first language that they learned in their home, which is not English, and they are presumed to have disabilities with the English language because it is not their first language. Therefore, they are considered bilingual in the emergent setting because they are trying to learn English as their second language, which does cause barriers and struggles in school settings, especially in the early years when they are first learning this. Some of the opportunities that classroom teachers have is in relationship to these students by providing them with opportunities for education. Educators have to step outside of their comfort zone, face some challenges, and they also have to expand their horizons and even fine-tune their teaching practices, because teaching a bilingual student is not as simple as it is teaching an all English-speaking classroom. Bilinguals sometimes don't understand some of the wording that is very normal to us. That word does not make sense to them from their language and their perspective. So teachers have opportunities to face that sometimes presents challenges in the teaching strategies. ESL is another term for students. These students are considered English as a second language. The language instruction programs are provided in the classroom in English only, and these children that are learning English as their second language, as I stated just a moment ago, these students are struggling with interpretation and complete understanding. Sometimes a word to us has a specific connotation, but ESL students do not understand those connotations, so the word doesn't sink in and have the same contextual meaning. They may take the term literally, whereas we take it contextually, and we can translate it into our experiences with that word. For example, if we said it's raining cats and dogs outside, we know in our culture, we know that this means it is raining very, very hard outside. A child, an ESL child, may not understand that kind of terminology in that context, and they might think, oh, wow, cats and dogs are falling out of the sky. So this is a real challenge, not only for the educators, but it's a challenge for those ESL students as well. Bilingual education simply means the ability to speak in two or more languages at a level that's equivalent to a native speaker. For example, and if you'll notice, and if you've ever been around ESL students in the school system, they are very fluent in the home with their native language because their parents typically still speak that in the home, but they are also very fluent with the English language that is used at school. So ESL students become very strong bilingual students in their ability to speak fluently in two different languages. Culturally and linguistically responsive education is simply education that's designed to seek positive changes in how schools are thinking about children from diverse backgrounds. And school systems have to then develop instructional practices that use the funds of knowledge about their students' culture and their language in respectful and meaningful ways, as well as in effective ways to support their learning. Too often, educators do not incorporate the linguistics or the culture of their bilingual students, their ESL students. They sometimes tend to demean those students, treating those students as though they have a disability because they live differently, have different cultures, have different backgrounds, and have different linguistic skills, different languages. These students, just because they are from a different culture or speak a different language, does not mean that they are less of a student in a classroom than the other students who speak English as their native language. Terms that describe students who are English language learners and consider children as having a deficit include the following. They're considered to be limited English proficient. They're considered to be English learners. They're considered to be English language learners. Culturally and linguistically responsive teaching is another term that is used to describe instruction and interactions that respond in positive and effective ways to support decisions about unbiased and accurate assessments, as well as instructional needs of these culturally, linguistically students. It is important to use their culture and their linguistics in response to the education models used in the classroom. These students deserve methods that will be meaningful to them, just as our English-speaking students. We try to present the material, and we should present the material in such a way that it makes sense, regardless of the culture or the linguistics. That's not done in every single classroom. It's very sad when it is not done that way. There are certain purposes and approaches that must be considered. Dual language or dual immersion education. That just simply means a variety of language instruction programs are provided in two languages. It should be provided in English and then a target language that's directed at the emergent bilinguals learning English in order to strengthen their heritage language and develop their English language. Now, I don't speak other languages. I know Pequita, very little. That's the Spanish word meaning very little. I know very little words in other languages, which means I could not stand up and teach a class using two languages. I have been to Mexico, and I have spoken before groups of people, and I've used an interpreter who would interpret what I'm saying. Sometimes having an interpreter in the classroom as the teacher presents some information or material, an interpreter could then translate that to the student in their native language, and the student will hear it in both languages, and this will strengthen their English learning skills, and at the same time it will enable the student to understand and comprehend quicker because they're getting it in their native language and it makes sense. Words are being used in such ways that it makes sense and connects. Not every school has interpreters for these particular students. Some schools are having the ESL programs, which means they have a teacher on hand that will work with these particular students that are really struggling with their English learning skills. Another approach is English speakers learning a target language, such as Spanish or French, so that we, the English speaker, can translate that. I did learn when I went to Mexico and I spoke, there were a few words that I was able to learn. It's been a long time since I've been there. So again, I know just poquito when it comes to speaking the language. There are a few phrases and words that I still remember, but I did not learn enough to do a whole presentation in another language. But I did learn enough that I could communicate when I needed to. And that would be very important. Spanish is the largest language that we have coming in within our area here. And so it would be helpful and beneficial for the English speaking instructor to learn a target language in order to communicate with the other students who speak that language as their native language. Another approach is language development level. The level of academic English language that a student has, basically from no practical speaking or reading proficiency in English to their native or bilingual proficiency equivalent to a native speaker or reader. What that means is their academic level of English language is very different from their bilingual, their native. So trying to enable them to become proficient in the English language just as they are proficient in their native language. Cultural responsiveness has to do with the ability to learn from and relate respectfully with people of our own culture as well as those from other cultures. It's easy for us to relate to people who have our same cultural background. We have to step out of our comfort zone when we start working with people from other cultures. And I've taught in school systems where people who are of other cultures are degraded and demeaned by other students. And yes, I've even seen it done by other faculty, by other educators. That's really sad, but we have to treat them with great respect because just because they're different or they come from a different culture does not mean that they are less of a person than we are. Modified cultural pluralism simply means multiple cultural subgroups living together in a manner that preserves the characteristics. We preserve their traditions, their culture, and even their language. The group promotes interaction between other groups. It creates a vibrant and viable and sustainable community if we can live together in cultural pluralism or having multiple cultures within subgroups living in the same area, going to school together. Social capital consists of two kinds of social interactions. One is bonding capital that strengthens cultural characteristics within a group. This would be the family. It could be a particular religion, a group of people who have the same ethnic background, the same ethnic race. And the second way is bridging capital, which promotes a more formal society tie across cultures to create mutual interests that strengthen the shared society. This would have to do with local, right here in our town, the state, and even on the national level then. Multicultural education is an education movement that promotes the concept that cultures are important and they are vibrant parts of the fabric of the United States. Too often, some communities view other cultures as less in value than the normal culture of that area. We don't accept multicultures within our communities, and that's something that teachers can make a big difference in the lives of their students, understanding other cultures. Something that I always enjoyed doing was having a multicultural study, and we would take a look at the different cultures. And it's also helpful if you have multicultures in your classroom, you can invite those students to bring things from their home that will represent their culture, their native culture. This could be their music, their food, their clothing, and they can share and tell their stories about their culture. And if this is done in the early grades and it's done all the way throughout, children will begin to be taught that different is not bad. You're different, but you're acceptable. I'm different. And we learn from each other, and we begin to appreciate the differences within our different cultures. Some of the population trends that are occurring now is what we're going to focus on now. Prevalence. Prevalence is the number of people in a given population who exhibit a condition of a particular state. This is determined by counting how often it occurs. For example, a number of people who speak other languages, or a number of students who are identified for special ed services. Disproportionality. This is over or under representation of a specific cultural or linguistic group within a specific setting when compared to the representation of a general population. Basically, what that means is the other culture or the other linguistic group may be overpopulated as compared to the norm of the class or the native students within the class, or they could also be underpopulated. When they become underpopulated, that's when they begin to feel like they don't belong and they struggle. Cultural and ethnic diversity. This increase has profound impact on schools and other support services to deliver instruction and assistance that genuinely helps these students. We do have diversity. This is growing. The cultural and ethnic diversity is growing rapidly in our school systems today. Because of the increase in this area, it is profoundly impacting the schools in how they provide instruction. It's difficult to target all levels of learners, and it's even more difficult when some of those levels of learners have cultural or linguistic backgrounds that are different and causes them to have more struggles in understanding and comprehending. Language diversity causes tremendous disadvantages from public education. And as I've said over and over and over, if the students are not understanding the instruction that the teacher is presenting, it is definitely going to cause a tremendous disadvantage for that student. Poverty. Poverty affects all aspects of ethnic groups. 20% of our children of all races today live in poverty. Poverty is a big deal. On page 100, if you'll look in your textbook on page 100, you'll see a chart that totally breaks it down. And I'm not going to go through this chart with you, but if you will look at this chart and you'll see the different areas and the different levels of poverty, you'll see that, yes, the white children who seem to be from the United States, there is a large percentage of them living in poverty. But if you'll notice, the poverty rate goes up as we begin looking at the different ethnic races of people. Poverty goes up. All of that factors into their language barriers, their struggles. They are at major disadvantages. Migrancy. This is the frequent movement from one place or area to another. This has a lot to do with students whose parents seek seasonal work. A lot of these students are they're very diverse in their cultural or their ethnicity, being from other countries, other cultures, other languages. They move around. They're not educated for various other reasons. They cannot get established jobs, so they find work as best they can, and many of them end up finding seasonal work, and they will move to this area. Maybe for the fall they'll move to a farming area, and then they will have to move elsewhere to pick grapes or peaches or apples, and then and they're constantly moving around. Their main goal and purpose is to find work so they can put food on the table and support their families. When this happens, though, the children move with the parents, and the children do not even have time to settle into a school before it's time for them to move to another area. So, children moving from school to school because of migrancy definitely affects the child's education and academic abilities. We also have another population trend occurring right now, and this is called unaccompanied minors. These are students that are 18 years old and younger. Yes, and younger, coming across American borders without adult supervision. They're coming by themselves. Oftentimes, these young people are escaping violence in their own countries. Some of them have family members already here. It may be uncles and aunts, um, other kinds of relatives living here, and they are escaping their native country to get away from the violence and coming to America by themselves. I can't imagine. It's scary enough for me, as old as I am, to travel with my husband to different places. But as a child, thinking about a child coming over by himself, it's really frightening. Basic interpersonal communication skills has to do with basic language that is used in simple social conversations with friends and to survive in English. Um, this is a funny, when the few times that I have been to Mexico, um, I remember talking with people, and they would tell us that learning Spanish in American high schools is so way different than actual Spanish that is spoken in those countries that speak Spanish. It is way different. It is not the same. So if you learned something in Spanish in your Spanish class, and then you go to a Spanish speaking country and you try to communicate in that way, they're going to know that you are not fluent in Spanish. You learned it in a high school classroom. Socially, it is just very different. But here's a social context of these students coming into American schools trying to speak American language, English language. They might say something like, "You play me." What that means is they're saying, will you play with me? I need not help. I do not need any help. You get milk me, meaning, would you get some milk for me? So they know enough words to communicate, but again, it sounds splotchy. We also want to take a look at the cognitive academic language proficiency. This is the measurement of proficiency in academic language. Of course, academic language is the language that's used in the classroom, it's used in professional settings, the textbook, the teacher's instructions, and so forth. Culturally and linguistically responsive teaching. We first want to look at the deficit education models. These are the models of education that practice that first, let's look at a child's deficiencies, and then let's make plans for educational interventions. Let's pull out the child's deficiencies and let's develop a plan so that we can intervene and help this child become educated. There's also the cultural bias. This is the negative attitude about cultures that are different from our own. These are typically based on myths or stereotyping. Cultural bias will cloud our professional judgment. Educators, teachers, please be cautious. Just because a student looks different because they're from a different country, they speak differently, they do things differently than what we were raised to do, that does not mean that they are not of the same equal student as the rest of the students in the classroom. But that's how they are treated. That cultural bias attitude does cloud our professional judgment, and it causes us to lump them in a stereotypical group of saying they're poor students, they will not succeed, and they become labeled. Attitudinal bias. This has to do with the negative attitudes about language, accents, poverty, and migrancy that often cloud professional judgment. Again, this is tied very much to their cultural bias. We have to be very cautious that just because they're different does not mean they do not deserve the best education we can provide them. Poverty is one that I know all of you in your classrooms, when you get your own classroom, you're going to have students in that poverty level. And just because a student is living in poverty does not mean that that student is not capable of excelling academically. Some of those students have brilliant minds, and if they may not be getting it in the home because the home cannot afford certain luxuries that other students have, such as trips, going to museums, and having access to cultural things within the world to give them insight, that's where the teacher comes into play. The teacher has to be the one to provide those types of learning opportunities and experiences for those students in that poverty level. Professional judgment. This has to do with an informed opinion based on specialized training in the area of being evaluated that bridges the gap between the quantitative data and the qualitative information when making decisions. Use professional judgment. Weigh it out in the balance. This is the quantitative data and this is the qualitative data. Look at all pieces of data when you are making your professional decisions as to the best intervention or the best educational methods and strategies for each individual student, not just the class as a whole, but each individual student. Effective teachers do the following. They ask the following questions. Who is this child? This one child. What are this child's strengths and needs? What are the policies in place to support this child? What programs and practices are available to support this child in the school setting? How can I collaborate with others to support this child's learning and development? How can I position this child for success in my classroom? What does the student already know? What valuable experiences and knowledge does this student bring to the classroom? What do their families bring in the way of learning, experiences, and knowledge into this classroom? And you may have to do this for every single child in your classroom. Ask these questions. And that way, whether they are culturally and linguistically all the same, but just on different learning levels, or whether there is cultural diversity in that classroom, ask these questions on every single child to make sure that you are providing differentiation in your instructional methods so that you are targeting the needs of every single child in your classroom. And remember, we have, in Introduction to Education, we have talked about differentiation and how to target your teaching strategies to meet the need of every single child in the classroom. Okay, I have put this from the textbook, and give me just a second. I want to turn in my textbook to this page. Okay, so this has to do with the process checklist for serving children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So there are questions that need to be asked. There is a process, and there is an issue or issues related to the process and the questions. The referral, testing, or diagnostic. Some of the issues involved would be language issues. Is the native language different from the language in which the child is being taught? And should this be considered in the assessment process? Think about that for just a moment. If you're giving a child a test or you're assessing a child and his native language is not the language that you're using in this assessment, is that really fair to this child? Because there are going to be words that you will use that this child will not understand. So some of these children, they may say, I don't understand, but the majority of these children are just going to go with the flow and give you some answers that are not completely correct. And they're not correct because they did not completely and fully understand what was being asked. Another one is cultural issues. What are the views towards schooling in the culture from which the child comes? For example, in that child's country, in that child's region of where that child grew up, do those children go to school like we do here from kindergarten through the 12th grade and then are expected to go on to college? Or do those children get early education and then they go into the workforce at, say, age 8 or 9? So you have to take into consideration all of the aspects of the cultural issues that might have an impact on that child being educated. Home issues. What is the family constellation and who are the family members? What is the family's economic status? What is the level of education of the parents? What funds of knowledge exist within that family? They have different pieces of knowledge. The parents have to be considered, and their own educational experiences. Another process is the classification, the labeling, or the class assignment change. And this is based on language issues. Does the proposed placement change account for any language differences that are relevant, particularly academic language? In other words, by placing this child, for example, in a special ed classroom, are we going to be providing that child with lessons incorporating his native language? Or are we just providing that child with watered down assignments? That is something to very strongly consider. Cultural issues. When we make some changes in a child's classroom status, the cultural issues have to be questioned. Does the proposed placement change consider any unique cultural views regarding schooling. Is the change viewed as safe by the student and the family? What is it going to do to that child to place him in a different learning setting? Um, and are you also going to factor in the language differences when you place that child in that other setting? Home issues, you have to go back and consider, does the proposed placement change consider pertinent family matters? When you bring that child into that new setting, are you going to take into account the things that are going on within the home? Another process is teacher conferences or home communication. We have to consider the language issues. Is the communication to the parents or other family members in a language they can understand? Most of the time, nearly every single classroom teacher sends parent notes home, letters home to the parent, newsletters, and it's all written in English. Well, parents that are of other cultures, other native languages, they can't read that. So they have to rely on their child oftentimes to read that to them. Now, let's think about that for just a moment. You've had some behavior issues with little Johnny. So you send a letter home to convey that information about what he's been doing in the classroom. And if Johnny is the one that's going to read it to mom and dad, do you think Johnny's going to paint the full picture? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. So think about that. There are programs today on the computer that you can have a letter translated into the parent's native language and then send the letter home in that way. The cultural issues to consider is, has a relationship been developed between the teachers and the family? Do cultural views influence the communication between the family members and the school as a formal governmental organization? Is there a cultural reluctance of family members to come to the school? Do they feel awkward? Do they even come because sometimes they're embarrassed? And that is a societal issue. We have to find ways to work with these parents, and we have to let these parents know that we think it's wonderful that they are sharing their culturally diverse student with our classroom, because our students in this classroom are going to be able to learn from them. And these parents, they have a lot to offer to the rest of our students in our classroom. So we have to consider the cultural issues. We look at the home issues. Is the family constellation such that communication with the schools is possible and positive? Are family members positioned economically and otherwise to respond to communications from the school in a productive manner? When they come in, do we treat them as though they are a respected and valuable parent within our community? And do we build rapport and relationship with them? And do we accept their viewpoint and their input when we're working with their students? These are some great aspects to look at, some great questions to answer when we're considering the best placement for these culturally and linguistically diverse students. Some of the important elements in providing successful interventions is, of course, gathering information in a culturally responsive way by learning specifically who the family is and acknowledging that family and that child without demonstrating a prejudice against that family and that child. We have to be able to recognize and understand personal attitudes and behaviors toward differing cultural groups. You may think, oh, I don't have a problem with that, but put yourself to the test. What's your first thought when you realize that you've got a Hispanic student in your classroom? When you have any other cultural ethnicity in your classroom, what's your first thought? What's your first response of action that you're going to take? We also have to understand and use students' strengths, their background knowledge, and their previous experience to enhance instruction in a way that will strengthen new learning experiences. Again, when we go back to the class Introduction to Education, if you've already had that class, we spend a little time on tests and the 4 domains. And in domain 1, one of the key factors is we have to know our students and we have to know their cultures and their backgrounds and their families so that we can plan lessons appropriately to target that student's needs and teach that student to the best of our ability. We have to create an inviting and caring classroom community that supports the development that supports the development of independence and collaboration. We want our classrooms to be of the nature that everyone in that classroom is on equal level as being a member of that class, and they love being in that classroom because they're made to feel so special. We have to build strong relationships with and among the students and their families. We have to also hold students highly accountable for their own learning. Yes, these students have to step up their game sometimes and be responsible for their own learning. I taught at a particular school one time, and I had a high population of Hispanic students, and several of these students, when it came to writing their essays, would tell me that they first have to write the essay in their own native language and then translate it into English, because finding all of the words to express themselves in their essays in the English language was not easy for them. These particular students worked way harder than the average classroom student that English was their native language. But they were willing to put forth that effort because they wanted to be academically excelled, and they wanted to be something once they graduated high school. Okay, so steps must be taken. First thing is to increase parent involvement. Parents have a wealth of funds of knowledge as contributors to the school. Parents have to be a part of their children's education. We cannot ignore these parents. We do not need to leave these parents out. We certainly do not need to treat these parents as though you are not from here, you do not know anything, we know what's best, we will tell you what we're going to do, and that's the way it is. They do not need to be treated that way. They needed to be treated as though they are a valuable team member when it comes to providing education for their children. They need to be part of us in making these plans and these educational developments for their children. Implement non-discriminatory and multidisciplinary collaboration. We need to properly provide culturally and linguistically responsive special education. Collaboration requires all professionals have a student and family-centered focus, and we should build a supportive and productive relationship with these families. In other words, we all work together as a team. That could be a good mantra for us to have posted on our wall, so that as parents come in to meet with us, or parents come to open house or parent teacher conferences, they see that mantra: all work together as a team. I like that idea. We must also take the step of providing non-discriminatory assessment. Test the child in the child's preferred language. Have an ESL, or if you don't have an ESL program at your school, have an interpreter that can read the test to the child and explain the test, or read the test in the translated language so that the child can comprehend. And I bet you the test scores would go up if the child could interpret and understand the test questions. Avoid assessment and measurement bias. Testing that does not create a disadvantage for the child, and it does not unfairly or inaccurately interpret the test results, is what needs to happen. In other words, when the tests are scored, if it is inaccurate interpretation, or if the child was at a disadvantage while taking the test, then the actual interpretation of the test results is going to be off, because it's not a true representation of what that child really knows. It is a language barrier. We need to take the step to use authentic assessments. This means to use performance-based assessments based on the real tasks that are carried out by these students as part of a regular classroom assignment, and we should evaluate them according to a rubric. Set up a rubric. What is this child supposed to know and do? And score that child based on, according to the rubric, what is the child supposed to know and do? Okay, and finally, let's take another look at who is this child. I'm going to ask you, after this lecture video, to turn to page 116 and look at this very carefully. Who is this child? This is an inclusive pedagogy framework. It is for collaboration, for common understanding, and united advocacy. The child needs to be considered, and all of these questions need to be considered and appropriately answered as we are planning each of our lessons. When we are planning our lessons, when we are teaching our lessons, and then at the end when we are assessing our lessons as to were all students able to comprehend and understand and demonstrate what I taught them. So please study this, and this is from the Inclusive Pedagogy Framework. This is some of the content information that you're going to need to know when you take your Praxis 2. It may not ask you this specifically, but it may give you scenario questions. So please go back and review this page, this chart, in your textbook. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this video lecture, and I hope it has helped you to better understand culturally and linguistically diverse children that we deal with in our classrooms. These population trends definitely have effects on the school systems. The language learning schools have four types of emergent bilingual learners. And if you look on page 102 and 103, you will see this broken down. But we have the newly arrived adequate school with adequate schooling. They've just arrived and they have been adequately schooled in their native country. Uh, these recent arrivals are usually less than 5 years in the United States. They are typically grades 2 through 12. They're adequate schooling in their native country, which means they've been pretty well educated, so they can catch up academically very quickly. Many will still score low on the test due to the language of that test. It is not their native language. Therefore, again, as we've already said several times in this lecture, they struggle with the comprehension or the actual interpretation of words. They also have the social and economic factors that have influence on them, and these could be positive influences, and sometimes they can have negative influences in their lives. The second effect that we see is newly arrived with limited formal schooling. These are recent arrivals that have been in the United States less than 5 years. They are, again, typically grades 2 through 12. These are the students that have had interrupted or limited schooling in their native country, and they have limited native language literacy. These are the students that are definitely going to be below grade level in math, and they're going to be poor academic achievers. Their social and economic factors are also going to influence them either negatively or positively. The third effect is the long-term English learner. These are students that have been in the United States 7 years or more. They're typically in grades 6 through 12. They do still have limited literacy in both their native language and English because they came over when they were so young. So they're struggling with their native language and they're struggling with English. They're hearing their native language at home, but they're not as fluent because they've come to the United States and they've begun to speak English, but their English may be somewhat sketchy or spotty at times, and then their native language because they're not using it except for when they're at home and they're not using it as often. Therefore, they're struggling with it as well. Some of these students may get adequate grades, but they're still going to score low on the test. And again, this goes back to their language barrier and the language used on the test. They're going to struggle with the content classes. They often have been retained. They are considered to be at risk for dropout. They get so frustrated, why even bother? These students are going to have inconsistent or even subtractive schooling. They're going to be absent more often. They have had ESL or bilingual instruction, but they've had no consistent program reinforced over and over and over. It's been more of a spasmodic. The fourth effect on schools is the potential long-term English learner. These are the students that recently arrived between the grades of kindergarten and first grade. Grades K through 5 have lived in the United States most of their lives, and they began school speaking language other than English, but they were caught early on in their early years, so they are able to get caught up rather quickly with their English language speaking skills. Their parents, however, have low levels of education, and their parents also seem to be struggling financially and even sometimes socially.